Here are just some of the crimes that this administration has taken part in. Espionage. Right? You're not allowed to give money or guns to terrorist groups. Ask Hamas how that's working out for them. Because the President of the United States continues to sign $440 million worth of money over to the Palestinian Authority unity government, which includes Hamas and Islamic Jihad, State Department-sponsored terrorist organizations. And the State Department has sided with Hamas, with the Palestinian Authority, with Islamic Jihad, called on Israel for restraint against terrorist groups that kidnap young Jewish boys and then proceed to murder them. They're doing this now on the basis of this Palestinian kid who tragically was killed by Jewish extremists. There is a vast difference between the two sides. There are no streets going to be named after these Jewish, pathetic pieces of human refuse who engaged in this conduct. They're going to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Every Jew who watched what happened on Sunday when this arrest took place and all this came out felt sick to his stomach. They felt like vomiting and never stopped vomiting. That was not true on the other side. When these 3 Jewish boys were killed, Hamas was celebrating. They ran ads in their newspapers showing these 3 Jewish boys as dead rats. Okay, there is a vast difference between the two sides, but of course this administration, this administration is not interested in any way in cracking down on terrorism. They're interested in funding terrorism. We've now reversed sides in the war on terror. Everybody who we were fighting has at one point or another received American money or guns, including ISIS, right, who are now fighting in Iraq. And both sides of that we're now funding. Right, Iran, we've relieved the sanctions on, so they're taking over the southern half of Iraq, and ISIS is taking over the northern half of Iraq because we funded their allies in the war against Bashar Assad, who, it turns out, we're now going to fund to fight ISIS. So we are now on every side of every issue except the right side, which in that arena of the world is Israel and Israel alone. And that's espionage, and it's a violation of the Arms Export Control Act to boot. The Arms Export Control Act suggests I cannot funnel, if I were to funnel a gun to ISIS, I'd be arrested. If President Obama does it, that's just American foreign policy. Involuntary manslaughter, right? The basic case of involuntary manslaughter, I'm a lawyer, so the basic case for involuntary manslaughter is a 3-pronged test, right? Somebody died, number 1. Somebody died as a result of reckless action, number 2. Number 3, the person who took that reckless action knew it was reckless and could result in death at the time. Okay, those are the 3 elements of involuntary manslaughter. Benghazi, anyone? Leaving no security anywhere in the vicinity, in an area where we were running guns to Syria through Turkey. In an area where the New York Times had reported literally the year before that the entire town was run by Ansar al-Sharia. And surprise, surprise, Ansar al-Sharia was behind the terrorist attack that killed Chris Stevens and 3 other Americans. Right? Who's responsible for that? Hillary Clinton's responsible for that. She's guilty of involuntary manslaughter. She shouldn't be worried about whether she goes to the White House. She should be worried about whether she goes to the big house. Unfortunately, we have an attorney general who would never prosecute anyone for these sorts of violations because he too is a criminal and he too is guilty of involuntary manslaughter, as it turns out. He greenlit the Fast and Furious program. Turns out that you might think that running guns to Mexican drug cartels, with no tags in them, by the way, there were no electronic monitors on these guns. It was widely known inside ATF that when you run guns to the Mexican drug cartels, the only place they're going to show up so that we can back-channel them, backtrack them, and figure out where they were is at crime scenes. This was explicitly known at the ATF at the time. You might think that's reckless. You might think that that might result in homicide, like the killing of a Border Patrol agent, perhaps. And you might be the head of the DOJ. And if you were involved in this, you were probably promoted. Because nobody who's responsible for Fast and Furious has gone to jail. Nobody's really even been fired. How about violation of internal revenue laws? If you or I were to leverage the IRS to crack down on particular folks, we would be put in jail. That's a violation of the Internal Revenue Code itself, 26 U.S. Code 7212 for people who are following. It's also a violation for politicians and for politically motivated bureaucrats to get involved, and this is a violation of the Hatch Act. Right? The Hatch Act prohibits bureaucrats from getting involved in political situations like this and targeting political opponents. It's a violation of law. But it's a phony scandal, according to the President of the United States. You want to know how corrupt and criminal and nasty this administration is? John Eastman runs the National Organization for Marriage. I'm sure some of you know of John. John's National Organization for Marriage is obviously a pro-traditional marriage organization. This administration is anti-traditional marriage. And so the IRS leaked the confidential tax information, including donor information, about the National Organization for Marriage, which is a 501c3, which means their donors are confidential. They leaked their entire donor list to the Human Rights Campaign, which is a gay advocacy group. Now, they used a middleman in order to do this. John's group, National Organization for Marriage, sued the IRS. The IRS acknowledged that they had, in fact, leaked this material and signed over $50,000 of your tax dollars to the National Organization for Marriage. Now, what John did is John said, okay, fine. You know, we'd like to find out who particularly at the IRS did this. Let's trace this back up the chain. Who decided that it would be a great idea to hand over confidential tax information to political opponents? Right? Who decided that would be a great idea? So they said to Eric Holder, why don't you prosecute the middleman, right, who had received the confidential tax information and distributed it in violation of law? Why don't you prosecute him? Eric Holder said, no one will be prosecuted for this. No one will be prosecuted for this. So John said, okay, fine. You're not going to prosecute him. Give him immunity. Because this guy was pleading the fifth. You can only plead the fifth if there is a threat of criminal prosecution. Right? You can't plead the fifth. If you come to me and you ask me if I was cheating on my wife, I can't just say I plead the fifth. That has no relevance. You're not threatening to criminally prosecute me. The Fifth Amendment is only available in situations in which you do not have immunity. So John said to Eric Holder, go ahead, give this guy immunity, then we can sue the IRS, we can subpoena him, and we can force him to answer questions about where he got this material. And Eric Holder said, I will not give him immunity. So in other words, he won't prosecute the guy to get the information, and he won't get immunity. He won't give immunity so the guy would give up the information. This is the height of criminality, and it's so blatant. And yet, has anybody outside this room ever heard of the National Organization for Marriage? Can you imagine if the NAACP had sued Bush's IRS, and Bush's IRS had said, yeah, you know what, we discriminated against you, here's a $50,000 settlement. You think that might lead the news for a few nights? But for the Obama administration, it will not even make the back page of the New York Times. How about unauthorized disclosure of information? You're not allowed to leak confidential national security information, and yet this administration has done that repeatedly. This administration has done it 4 separate times with regard to Israeli national security information, sunk Israel's ability to strike Iran. Israel was supposed to use an airbase in Azerbaijan to strike Iran. That was leaked by the Defense Department to the New York Times. Israel was supposed to work with the Saudis to use Saudi airspace to strike Iran. That was leaked by the Defense Department to the New York Times. Israel was behind Stuxnet. That was leaked by the Defense Department to the Washington Post. And Israel was working out agreements with particular groups to go in and try and decapitate some of the heads of the nuclear program. That was also leaked by the Defense Department to the Washington Post. But it's not just Israeli national security information that's being leaked. You know how we all knew that President Obama had his kill list? You know, Rand Paul has been very big on President Obama has his kill list. American citizens abroad who he just decides we can kill. Which, by the way, is, regardless of what you think of the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, and I'm fine with it. He's a terrorist. He deserved to die. The possibility that we now live in a country where the president can determine, based on which side of the bed he woke up this morning, whether to hit somebody with a drone or trade them for 5 Taliban terrorists is frightening. That should be frightening. Bo Bergdahl was no friend to the United States, according to most reports. And yet he was an American citizen who had to be brought home just in time for the president to quash the VA scandal. He had to be brought home at the cost of 5 top Taliban officials. Because he was an American citizen, he had to be brought home. Well, if his name happened to be Anwar, he'd be dead from a drone strike in Yemen. So the president literally, I mean, that is, if there's anything that speaks to dictatorial power, it is the ability of the president to unilaterally declare who is an American citizen and who is not an American citizen for the purposes of hitting them with a drone or trading terrorists for them.